Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Hello, compañeros, and welcome to episode 80. My name is Carlos L. Chacon, your host, and we're going to excuse Steve Stedman from our opening today. I just had a scheduling conflict. He wasn't able to join us, but he will be here in the interview. Today, our topic is containers. Containers, I think, are interesting. They are going to be shaping the way that we can provide service, particularly in our dev and test environments, and just make that easier for us, for our development teams. And then I think we'll see how they progress into the production environments. Lots of love right now currently for containers on the Linux side. I'm reaching out today. Our guest is Andrew Pruski. Andrew is originally from Great Britain, but he's been working in Dublin, Ireland as a database administrator for the last 3 years. And he's been writing quite a bit about containers on his blog. So I invited Andrew on, wanted to talk with him. One, because I wanted to see how he was using them in the Windows environments. And he's also using them for some of the older versions of SQL Server, right? So container support really kind of came on in 2016, again, kind of in the Linux environment. The Windows side is getting a little bit of love in Windows Server 2016, but wanted to see how he's doing it. He's actually using a tool, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And he gives us good ways just to kind of get our feet wet with some of this. And so I hope that you'll find this conversation interesting and valuable as another way in which you can contribute to the way that your environments get set up and managed. We do want to give a quick shout out to Dakpack Zach on Twitter. He mentions that he enjoyed episode 76 with Jimmy May. Now, in preparation for our next episode, we were actually talking with Randolph West, who will be our guest. And he mentioned that Jimmy May actually has an entry in imdb.com. So if you're interested in seeing Jimmy May's movie credits, you can head over there to imdb.com and check that out. With that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about SQL Server in the news. Of course, it should be no surprise that the SQL Server program team continues just to go gangbuster over vNext, right? So now that will be the next version that they release of SQL Server. And they announced, I guess not last week now, that CTP 1.2, so the Community Technology Preview 1.2 is now available. Some bug fixes and whatnot, but the big change for this version appears to be SUSE Linux support. And so again, if that's the version of Linux that you're interested in running, then of course, then that vNext version is available for you. I think with the amount of changes and the progress that they're making there, it's going to be very difficult to keep up with what's what here. And so it'll be interesting to see how we have to adapt, and much less our organizations, to all these different changes. And interestingly enough, because of all of that, I think that's why containers make a lot of sense, because this will help ensure that our environments are consistent and that we don't have different service packs or other different components that maybe we don't need. And we can different service packs or other different components that maybe we don't need. And we can kind of get rid of that question of, well, it worked on my machine. I hope that you enjoy the conversation with Andrew. I think that it's interesting and informative. So I guess with that, let's go ahead and jump into the conversation with him. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yes. So one of the reasons I reached out to you is ultimately our topic today is containers. And you had put out a series of posts on your blog about containers. So I wanted to have you on because I think containers are going to impact database administrators here in the coming months and if not years. And I heard the analogy. And most of what we've been hearing from the containers has kind of come from the Linux side, but it seems like the Windows side is starting to speed up there as well. But one of the analogy that I heard was that containers containers are to environments much like VMs were to servers, and just kind of carving them up and making them their own little islands, if you will, so that you can then move them around much easier. That is kind of what the container idea brings to a specific application. And in this case, we're talking about SQL Server in the container. So is that like a fair representation or understanding of containers? And I guess why don't you start us off and take us through kind of that definition of what containers are and how you've been using them?
Yeah, I definitely would say that it's a good analogy. On the horizon, especially the Linux has been out for a while now, it's a more established technology, but the Windows side is coming up fast. And as you said, in the next months or years, we're going to be looking at containers getting more and more popular and more diverse with the amount of software that you can run in them. And especially with Microsoft announcing support opposed to VMs, is if you have a bunch of different apps that you want to run in an environment, maybe you have VM with all the apps running, but if you have the same app that you want to run multiple instances of, then containers can definitely be the way forward for you.
Right. So it's kind of that encapsulation of an application that I can then move the application around.
Yeah, so it's definitely for stateless apps. They'll give you the portability feature is very, very good. I mean, with the SQL Server, I think the main advantage that you're going to get with containers is the ability to spin up an instance in a very, very short period of time. So if you need a quick throwaway instance of SQL Server to do some development or testing on, containers are definitely going to be the way forward.
Right. So I guess talk to us about how you started integrating containers into your environment.
So my QA and dev departments have a couple of old servers sitting in a back room somewhere that they've installed a hypervisor on, and they've got access to it. And they're constantly building VMs, testing their apps, and then blowing away the VM. And they're doing this every single time. And each time they do that, they're also installing this every single time. And each time they do that, they're also installing a local instance of SQL Server. Now, the servers they're running on aren't exactly high spec. We're talking, 72K disks, CPUs that are 5 years old, probably older. The install time for these VMs was taking, I've seen up to an hour, and they'd install SQL and then start restoring all our databases from baselines kept in TFS. And this process wasn't exactly reliable either. And when it did fail, they're left churning through error logs and whatnot. And I mean, I was looking at this process and always thinking that, there has to be a better way. But what do you do? I mean, this process has been in place for a while. I didn't really have a better option to give them until probably about this time last year, I started reading about containers and what options were there. So I started having a look around and got into the companies that are out there, Docker being the main prevalent one, and started researching into containers and how SQL can integrate with those. And what I basically did was I went off with a couple of my sysadmins and asked if there was a spare box lying around that I could provision, wiped it, installed an OS on it, and then got the containers up and running. The idea is, instead of these guys building their VMs, deploying their apps, and then installing SQL Server, is they deploy their apps to their VMs, but then they run all those apps, then contact a container that's spun up on a separate host, our container host. And the benefits that we saw, we went from, say, an install time of 40 minutes to an hour to spinning up a container in about 2 minutes. That's a new instance of SQL Server with all our databases available. Bear in mind, they are small databases, but they're the same databases they were using for the full install. So from 40 minutes to about 2 minutes is a huge saving.
Right. Now, does that require an application change? So you mentioned instead of pointing them to the database, they get pointed to the container. Instead of giving them, a la port 1433, and, server name, that you're giving them a container name now, and then there's another layer there?
No. So what we did was, one of the prerequisites I had was I didn't want them to change their process too much. All I wanted to do was remove the install of SQL Server and have everything else exactly the same. So what we did was, I've written a PowerShell script that goes off and creates the container from calling the Docker daemon. It then creates a bunch of aliases, SQL client aliases, on the application servers, because all our applications use DNS entries to contact the apps, to contact the database. So instead of using DNS, the client alias overwrites the DNS entry with the new container port number. So the app doesn't know anything about it. The app still thinks it's talking to an instance of SQL somewhere, when really it's talking to a container.
Gotcha.
Okay, so then to take an example, like what I do today, because I work on the database health monitor application, and part of that is testing it on lots of different versions of SQL Server, everything from 2005 all the way through 2016, and different installs from Express to Standard, and different installs from Express to Standard to Enterprise. And to do that, I have a number of VMs that I've spun up, and then I also have stacked instances on each of those VMs. So it sounds like if I was using containers, instead of having all those VMs and stacked instances, I could just have a container that I spin up with that test environment, do what I need to do, and then turn it back off again. Am I following this correctly?
Yep. That's it exactly, yes. Instead of having your instance there, you could literally just kick off a little script that you've got, just say, create me a new container from a saved image that I've got, that I've built especially for this one test purpose, and off you go.
Okay, nice.
So again, there's a host server, right? That host server is going to have an operating system.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm installing the containers on top of that. And my application could be a container and my database is a container, and they can talk to each other.
Yes. And then you'd have your container daemon running that would create your containers for you, which basically it's just a service that you call to say, spin me up this container, spin me up that container.
Very cool. And so we talked about Docker being kind of the leading technology there. And it seems like, so as we mentioned, all the love was kind of going to the Linux world, but you're doing all of this in a Windows environment.
I am. So one of the things that tripped me up at the start of the year was, great, so we're getting support for containers on Windows, which is absolutely brilliant. And I think Microsoft announced that partnership with Docker way back in 2014. So we've all been sitting on our hands going, come on then, when's it going to happen? But it started to progress this year, and they started releasing Windows Server 2016, the community technology preview, and Windows 10 as well. If you're in the Insider Track preview, if you have the Enterprise Edition, you can run containers on Windows 10.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, as you said, Linux was getting all the love, and we're finally starting to see some of that come through now. We're getting the same functionality that these guys have been playing around with for a while.
Right. So what are the apps or the components that you're using on the Windows side to get that done? Because it seemed like you're really just talking about, from an operating system perspective, it seemed like Windows Server 2016 was the operating system where that finally arrived.
Yeah. So that's the operating system that Microsoft announced, the first supported feature, as it were. It's actually an inbuilt feature that you can switch on when you install the operating system. So it's just like anything else, like .NET and things like that. And then it's literally just running a couple of scripts to install the Docker engine, and you're away. You can be up and running with it in less than 10 minutes.
So when you say less than 10 minutes, is that less than 10 minutes for someone who's a pro with Docker, or less than 10 minutes for someone who's just getting started?
It literally is enable a feature, run, I think it's 2 scripts, and you've got your service up and running. So it's very, very simple.
Okay, so then today I know if I'm working with a VM to sort of make my own environment, I remote desktop to that VM, I do whatever I need to do with it. And actually, remote desktop to that VM, I do whatever I need to do with it, and then I can shut that VM down later. But with containers then, is it similar that you connect to that container and then you have a choice of saving what you've done or aborting it and going back to that original state?
Yeah. So what you can do is you initially connect to the Docker daemon, and you can create your own base images from templates. So you'd have your base OS, which I think is Windows Core on 2016. And then you can get a SQL image, download that, and spin up your SQL container. Then what I did was install a load of databases, shut that container down, and save that as a new image that I could then create new containers from. So instead of having to restore databases each time into each container, when I spin a new container up, those databases are already there in the state that I wanted them in.
Well, I guess I'm not sure that I quite understand that either, because the databases, I thought the databases were not actually part of the container. Now, maybe this, right? Like I can move my container around and those database files are not part of the container.
Okay. Yeah. The portability feature of the containers is something that I haven't actually played with that much, and something I'm looking at getting into. What I've been mainly concerned with is I want an instance of SQL up and running very quickly. The software that I've been working with, which I'll mention a bit, called Windocs, is don't think you get that functionality because it is obviously dependent on the IO subsystem. One thing I have tried now is that with the Windows containers, the ones that are supported on 2016, the database and the SQL instance are all wrapped up in the container, which is IO independent. I need to double check that, I'm afraid, guys, but you can basically push your image up to the Docker hub, save it there, and then pull it down onto a different server, and the databases will all be there.
So I do want to insert just really quickly, after we stopped recording, we followed back up with Andrew, and he did confirm that any databases that get created within the container that are then used to create a custom image. So if the container has a custom image and has a database in it, the database will get created anytime that image is used again. So they do follow you around, and you'll have them. So right now, again, that's what I've been seeing from these demos, or at least part of what they've been talking about. It seems like from an application perspective, it's a little easier to understand and grasp. But from the database perspective, yeah, it seems like there's a little bit of a leap there still.
Yes, obviously with apps, they're stateless, so it doesn't really matter where they live, and they're not dependent on the IO subsystem. But with SQL Server, so dependent on the IO subsystem, it takes a little bit of getting your head around how it's actually all working in the background.
Right. You'd mentioned your WinDocker tool, and one of the things you liked about it, and the reason you're using it, besides the fact that it will run on Windows, was that it helps support previous versions of SQL Server.
Yes, so that was another thing that sort of tripped me up at the start of the year as well when it comes to this is available on Windows Server. What you've got up in the Docker Hub at the moment is Express editions of 2014 and 2016, then full edition of the vNext edition of SQL Server, which I think all the features are available that are available on Windows Core. So it's pretty fully fledged database engine there. But again, it's a higher version of SQL, which I wouldn't say anyone is using particularly right now. And what I found was there's no point in getting my QA and dev people testing on a higher version than I have in production. We're running Windows Server 2012 R2 with SQL Server 2012. As far as I know, we have no plans to upgrade in the next year anyway. So what I did is I had to go out and start looking for, is there a software solution out there that will give me SQL Server 2012 running in containers? I eventually found, this company out of Seattle called Windocs, who have basically built a custom port of the open source software that Docker has put on the market, which allows earlier versions of SQL Server to run in container free communities. I mean, that was pretty chuffed with that because that was exactly what I needed. So I went off and chatted. They've got a free community edition, which I went and grabbed off them and talked to my sysadmins, grabbed my old beat up server, installed Windows Server 2012, followed the Windocs installation instructions, which again was pretty simple. And they've even simplified it more since I had first run it. And it's basically a PowerShell script to get the engine up and running. And once you've done that, you're good to go. That has allowed us to get SQL Server 2012 in containers on Windows Server 2012. So I've got my dev and QA teams now working with containers that are on the same level and patch level as my production environment.
So then what's the difference between the community edition and then the paid version?
It's basically the number of containers that you can have.
Okay. What's the community edition limit you to?
I think it limits you to 2.
Okay.
It literally is just a sort of gateway to show you how the functionality works and what you can do with it.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Okay, so in that solution then, if you're downloading the container with the SQL Server version to match what you're using in production, how is the licensing then done on that? Are you then having to put your own license codes in for SQL Server?
We've used the developer edition so that we've neatly sidestepped all that.
Oh, perfect.
But I think the way it's going to work with, say, like standard, I think it'd be nuts to go with enterprise in a container at the moment, but I think it would work the same with you'd license your host and you can build from there. So like a data center license, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way to make that adoption and to get comfortable with it is to using containers in those lower environments because they do tend to move. You want to spin them up, you want to take them down, you want to shake and bake them a little bit more than your production environments, obviously. And that's actually what containers are really, really good at as well. That's an interesting approach.
Definitely treat the container as a throwaway object, as in if you go out and nuke this one, don't spend time restoring, blow it away, run a script, build your new container.
Right. So if you wanted to add a new database to the container, what's that like?
It handles and works exactly like a normal instance of SQL through Management Studio. Apart from obviously don't think you get the agent, so that's the only thing you will see. But you create your database, and if you wanted to then replace your base image, you'd stop that container. To then replace your base image, you'd stop that container, blow away your original image, and save that as your new image. And then you've got an updated image with your new database. I mean, that's part of one of the reasons as well that we went for containers instead of deploying to VMs, because the guys were deploying our databases from baselines, backup files, basically kept in TFS, and then applying a load of updates to each and every database to get it to the level of production. Whereas what we're doing now is every week we have a certain amount of releases, and at the end of the week I deploy all our releases to our base image, update that image, blow the old one away, save the new one, and then next week they can all blow their containers away, build new ones in a couple of minutes, and they've all got up-to-date containers exactly the same as our production environment.
Gotcha.
So then for that development environment, you're then able to get those containers, sounds like up to date, a lot quicker than if you had like a developer edition installed on every developer's machine.
Definitely.
In that you're able to just grab that latest package or latest container, and then everyone's on the same baseline rather than each developer maybe getting out of sync somewhere.
That's it. Yeah. So we can say to them, you've all got your dev VMs pointing to these containers. These containers are now out of date. Blow those away, build your new ones, and you've got every single one of you has got a replica of exactly the same image, which is up to date with production.
Yeah, I could see how that alone would just save a massive amount of time and make it worthwhile.
And confusion.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, well, the deployment worked on my VM, but it's not working on yours. Why is that? Because there's a mismatch there, which we've now managed to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. How many times have we heard that? Right. Well, it works on mine.
Yeah, that's one of the standard developer lines, I thought. Yeah.
So I guess we've talked a little bit about some of the pieces that you've used. I guess any other, advice as for being up and running?
It is very simple to get up and running. Bearing in mind that this is brand new technology. I mean, we've had a few issues with integrating into our own processes. I think the main bit of advice I'd give anyone looking to go with containers is don't go with containers just because you want to use containers. Have a look at your business processes and practices and see how they're going to fit in there. So don't try and work containers into them if it's not going to be right, because they are a great technology to work with, but you really need a business case for them there.
Okay. But I guess I'm going to have to say that I think that particularly that scenario that you just provided, almost everybody has that circumstance with their lower environments. Well, I guess assuming they're development shops, right? If you're installing SharePoint, for example, and that's your application, then maybe that wouldn't necessarily apply. But I would think most development environments you could make the case for that.
Yeah, agreed. I would say just have a look at it and see what they can do for you. I'm very guilty of what they can do for you. I'm very guilty of, it's shiny technology. I want to use it and I want to play with it. But I really had to put out a business case to get this in, and it's been working pretty well. I mean, we have had some issues with the fact that sometimes the containers are up and running and it's new and it has crashed, and then we have to redeploy and do things like that. But we're getting into the habit of the throwaway objects, get rid of them, rebuild, and you've got another one straight there.
All right. So then, I mean, sounds like containers have been around with Linux for much longer than they have with Windows, obviously, because it's brand new to Windows. But are there any real conceptual differences between containers on Linux versus containers on Windows other than the obvious operating system differences?
I wouldn't say there's any conceptual differences. I think the main thing is that, as you said, they've been around on Linux for a lot longer, so the technology is a little bit more mature, and some of the features, I think some of the networking stuff isn't available on the Windows side yet, but it's a case of just watch this.
Up a VM with Hyper-V, it's doing this virtualized network interface for that VM. Is there something similar for containers where they're getting a virtual network interface, or are they using the network card directly of the OS?
Not too sure, I'm afraid, actually, there. The way I've been working with the containers is each SQL instance listens on its own specialized port that you can specify when you create the container. So you can map host port to the container port. And when you're connecting locally, you'll connect on the host port. When you're connecting remotely, you'll get your individual port that you've specified when you create the container. So that's the one thing we did when we were building the containers in the aliases that I mentioned, is that we used aliases because you can't use, say, like host name entries because you can't specify a port. But with aliases, you can say, connect to this server on this port, and that takes them straight through into the SQL instance.
Right. So that mapping actually happens in the container. You can specify when that mapping actually happens in the container. You can specify when the incoming port is this, send it here.
So it's a little switch when you specify, say, create a container from this image, this port to this port, off you go. It does mean there are differences when you connect, say, if you're on the VM where the host is running, where the containers are running, you'll be connecting on a different port to it as you were if you were outside of that VM.
Okay, so then for someone like me who has not used containers before, but it sounds interesting and I want to go give it a try, is there any advice that you would just recommend to watch out for or to be aware of on that first time giving it a try?
If I was going to do that, just to jump in here, Andrew, I think, so obviously on the Windows side, right, you have WinDocs, the community edition, to kind of get started. And then I would jump to Andrew's blog and start there.
But yeah, I mean, blog series I've written from part 1 to part 4 will take you through initial setup and then playing around a little bit, and then actually working with a Docker Hub as well, which will allow you to down and things like that.
And that site is dbafromthecold.wordpress.com. Is that right?
That's it, yes.
And we'll have that available in our show notes as well, which will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/containers.
Perfect. Well, I think that wraps up the questions I've got about getting started.
Okay, awesome. So great conversation, great, interesting technology. Thank you for kind of walking us through some of these use cases that you're using it for. And I think particularly on the Windows side, because admittedly, that's where I feel more comfortable. I'm interested in trying WinDocs and kicking the tires there, see how it goes.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. There's a couple of things I'll come back to you on about, especially about the network adapter. That was an interesting question that I wasn't too sure on, and also I do also want to double check upload and download of containers into the Docker Hub and see if it actually just keep the actual state of the SQL instance, or will it take the databases with you? So I can come back to you on that if you'd like,
or I'll post.
Yeah. So should we go ahead and do SQL Family?
Yeah, let's do that. So how did you get started first using SQL Server?
Well, the first job I got was with local government coming out of university, and it was writing crystal reports. I didn't have any idea what the back end was. I was just writing SQL queries. I thought it was Oracle at first, but it was actually SQL Server. And I was writing cursors and things were running slowly, and I started doing a lot of Googling around how to speed things up, or just basically how to do certain things with SQL I didn't know. And I eventually stumbled across SQLServerCentral.com and found this huge wealth of information about this whole entire industry of professions that I had absolutely no idea about, and just started piqued my curiosity from there. And eventually decided after a couple of years I wanted to become a DBA.
Very cool. Well, so then how did you get your first job as a DBA?
Think complete and utter luck.
Get your first job as a DBA?
Think complete and utter luck. I was very, very inexperienced, and I was applying for jobs and eventually got an interview with a place called the United Kingdom Hydrographic Office. And the interviewer there gave me a chance and gave me my first job as a DBA. It's got to be about 5.5 years ago now.
Very cool. Okay. Now, if you could change one thing about SQL Server, what would it be?
The cynic in me says I want to have a dark theme for Management Studio, but I don't think it's going to ever happen anytime soon.
Now, I have seen other themes, particularly the developers using, that they're importing from Visual Studio and whatnot. Have you played around with those at all?
Yeah, there is a little hack that you can do to Management Studio to get it to show up the dark theme, but obviously they haven't. It's not finished, and not all of the windows will show correctly.
Oh, gotcha.
It's based on Visual Studio, so it's sort of, come on, Microsoft. It can't be that difficult, can it?
I don't know. It sounds like a podcast episode. We need to investigate.
Okay, so what's the best piece of career advice that you've ever received?
In my second year of being a DBA, I was very lucky to go and one on Paul Randall's SQL Skills courses in London. I don't know if you guys have heard this story. I've heard it tells it a couple of times about a bank, and they had to restore their database at one point. They had a load of backups, but they had something like one full backup a week ago, and then how many thousands of log backups. And it took them all week to restore their databases and get it back to the point of the failure. And by that time, the bank had an absolute nightmare. And I think he said they went out of business. But his bit of advice was, don't think about backup strategies. Think about your restore strategy and how you're going to use those backups to get your databases to the point in time of the failure. And I've also, that's a very, very good bit of advice.
Right.
Good point. And although that's a technical piece, it could be a career-changing move if it's not done correctly.
Super.
Definitely.
No, that's right. Or in that case, a business-changing. The whole business went out of business.
Yep.
Our last question for you today, Andrew. If you could have one superhero power, what would it be and why do you want it?
Well, I guess being a Brit living in Ireland, I've spent so much time in Dublin Airport that if you give me the chance to be able to fly, I take that. So, yep, definitely it'd be the ability to fly, guys.
It's interesting. A lot of people have answered with the ability to fly, but the reason is always different.
Right. Well, awesome. Well, Andrew, thanks again so much for being on the show today. Great conversation. And we look forward to talking with you more and about containers, seeing where that goes.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much, guys.
Have a great day.
Cheers.
Okay, well, that's going to do it for today's episode. Thanks again for joining us, compañeros. I hope that you found the conversation interesting. Again, I know that this is something I need to play around a little bit more with. As for as many people as we talk with, I always make the goal like, oh, I'm going to follow up with that. I haven't quite jumped into the Windocs stuff yet, but that is still something on my plate. And so I think we'll circle back around and talk about that in a couple of weeks. If you have other questions or want to give us feedback, of course, you can do that through iTunes reviews. We're always appreciative of those. The show notes for today's episode will be available at SQLDataPartners.com/container. We'll make it with the S and without the S, just so that removes confusion there. But of course, you can reach out to us on Twitter. If you have any questions, you can use the hashtag SQL Podcast, or I am at Carlos L. Chacon, and Steve is at SQL EMT. Thanks again for joining us this episode, and have fun on the SQL Trail.